In this video, we're going to focus on what is known as the attack sequence. Whether you are firing plasma, hacking with a choppa, or manifesting psychic attacks, it all boils down to the attack sequence and injury roll.
This is a very important concept to master, as it will comprise the majority of your dice rolling in Kill Team. It involves back and forth communication and dice rolls between you and your opponent to determine accuracy and the force of attacks, as well as the defending model's ability to resist incoming damage. The vast majority of this information can be found on pages 30 through 33 of the core rulebook. So with that said, let's get into it.
Before we get into the steps of the attack sequence, this is a great spot to take a moment and talk about dice modifiers. In brief, there are situations or abilities that can improve or impair your chance of success when rolling your dice. For example, an obstacle in the way of your attack can decrease the chance for a successful hit. Situations that improve your odds for success are positive modifiers to the dice roll, such as a +1. Conversely, situations that impair you give negative modifiers, such as a -1. When applying a modifier to your dice roll, you should first roll a d6. You then add or subtract the relevant modifiers from the value on that die. You then compare that final value to your threshold for success.
Let's break this down with an example. If you are making a shooting attack with a tactical marine, your chance to hit is your ballistic score, which is a 3+ or a 3 up, meaning that on a value of 3 or higher with your d6 roll, you will have a successful hit. If your target is behind cover, however, you would suffer a -1 modifier as a penalty of your to hit roll from this condition. Now, you would roll a d6, and let's say for this example you get a 4. You would subtract 1 from this value to account for the modifier, and your end result is therefore a 3. The 3 is then compared to your ballistic score, and you determine that despite your opponent's positioning, you are still able to land a hit. You can have multiple modifiers affect a single d6 roll. In this situation, you have to take into account the net sum of all modifiers.
Now, this sounds like a lot of work, and the truth is no one really does all this math after the roll. It's commonplace for you to account for any modifiers and agree on them with your opponent prior to making your roll in order to speed things up. In our same example, if you do the math ahead of time, you would need a minimum of 4 on the dice to hit. Now when you roll your d6, you say that you are looking for 4 ups in order to have a success. We won't cover all the modifiers in the game right now. We'll discuss the common modifiers you'll come across as they become relevant in this and later videos.
Let's get back to the attack sequence. The first roll of the attack sequence is the hit roll, where you determine if your attack can hit your target. This roll is made by the attacker. You roll a d6 and compare this to the attacking model's ballistic skill, if making a ranged attack, or its weapon skill, if making a melee attack. As we just discussed, you have to take into consideration any modifiers to your roll before determining if your attack successfully hit your target.
For hit rolls, an unmodified 6, meaning if your d6 lands with the 6 side up, is always a hit no matter how many modifiers are in play. Conversely, an unmodified 1 is always a miss. Once you have some experience under your belt, we encourage you to look at our video, Take the Shot, where we discuss nuances in positioning and how this can affect your success rate with your hit rolls.
If you successfully hit your target, you then proceed to the wound roll. This roll determines if your attack was a glancing blow or if it struck true. As with before, this roll is also made by the attacker. To determine what your threshold of success is, you need to compare the strength of the attack made to the toughness of the defending model. There's a handy table on page 31 of the core manual, but we'll go through that in detail in a moment. Let's talk about where you find these strength and toughness values first.
For ranged weapons, the strength is fixed to the actual weapon. This bolt gun has a strength of 4. For melee weapons, the strength is a factor of the weapon and the model's base strength, which makes sense, right? Doesn't matter how sharp your sword is if you don't have the strength to swing hard. This combat knife is strength user, meaning that you just use the base strength of the model. This power fist is ×2, meaning you double the strength statistic of the attacking model.
Once you have determined the strength of the attack, you then compare this to the toughness of the defending model, as noted on their datasheet. If your attack is equal in strength to the defending model's toughness, your chance to wound is a 4 up, or a 50% chance. If your attack is stronger, meaning it's a larger number, your chance to wound is a 3-up, or a 66% chance. If your attack is double the defender's toughness, your chance to wound is a 2-up, or an 83% chance.
Now, this works the other way too. An attack that is weaker or less than the defender's toughness will wound on a 5-up, or a 33% chance. And if your strength is half or less of the defender's toughness, only a 6 will wound the defender. As with the hit roll, an unmodified 6 will always successfully wound, and an unmodified 1 will always fail to wound.
If you were able to wound your target, your opponent now gets to determine if their armor can shrug off the attack. This is known as the saving throw. Unlike before, this roll is made by the defender by rolling a d6 and comparing that result to their model's save, or SV, characteristic on that model's datasheet.
The only modifiers to this are the armor piercing, or AP, of the attacking weapon. Using our example from before, this combat knife has no armor piercing, therefore the defending model has no modifiers to take into consideration. However, the Power Fist has a whopping AP of 3, meaning the defending model has a -3 modifier that they have to apply to their save roll. To give that perspective, if the defender's armor would previously have saved them from the attack on a 3-up, if the attack comes from the Power Fist, now they can only save on a 6 on their d6.
Also, this is the only roll in the attack sequence where a 6 is not always a success. This is relevant as it is possible to have such a high armor-piercing characteristic on a weapon that even some of the toughest models would only be able to save on a 7 on their d6. Last time I checked, none of my d6s went as high as a 7. In this situation, the defending model would not be able to make the save at all, and by default this is considered a failed save.
There are some models in Wargear that grant an invulnerable save. This type of save ignores the modifier for armor piercing. You do not get to use both your regular and invulnerable saves, however. You can only choose one, so it goes without saying that you choose the save with the best chance for success. Whether making a regular or invulnerable save, unmodified ones are always a failure.
If the defending model fails their save, they then would take wounds equal to the damage characteristic of the attack. The combat knife does 1 damage, while the Power Fist does variable damage per attack.
But hold on, we can't get to the damage just yet. Some models have a rule, which is uncommon but does exist, that allows models an extra chance to ignore damage allocated to them. The faction most notorious for having this ability, is the Death Guard. The rule for them is called Disgustingly Resilient, and it reads, each time a model with this ability loses a wound, roll a d6, and on a 5+, the model does not lose that wound. There are no modifiers to this roll.
There are many similar rules to this that other factions have, and, quite inconveniently, all of them have different names. In the community, this dice roll is globally referred to as a feel no pain. So, as the rule reads, for every wound that the defending model would lose, you roll a d6, and in this case, on a 5-up, you would ignore it. For weapons that deal more than 1 damage, even if the defending model has only 1 wound, they must roll the same number of dice as the damage characteristic of the incoming attack and hope for a 5-up on each and every die in order to ignore all of the incoming damage.
We have one last thing to cover before we get to the injury roll: mortal wounds. Mortal wounds are a specific type of attack that bypass the attack, wound, and save rolls and allocate a wound to the model. Psychic attacks are the most common source of mortal wounds, but some weapons can inflict mortal wounds as well.
This will not skip a feel no pain roll if the defending model has a rule like that. Due to the wording of these rules, as a mortal wound attack causes the model to lose one of its wounds, the rule is not bypassed and the defending model still gets to roll and see if they can ignore this brutal attack.
Finally, we come to the injury roll. We could, and probably should, do a whole video on this alone. Once everything before this has resolved, some amount of damage may have been dealt, defined by the damage characteristic of the attack or the number of mortal wounds inflicted. Some attacks can deal variable damage, such as a d3 or d6. In this case, you must roll the damage dealt for each attack one at a time, and the damage dealt by each individual attack is applied sequentially. Whenever a model is reduced to 0 wounds remaining, stop resolving all other attacks made on the model by the attacker. They are discarded, and only the attack that reduced the target to 0 wounds matters now.
For the injury roll, you use a number of die equal to the damage characteristic of the weapon that took the target to 0 wounds. If mortal wounds brought the target to 0, you will only use a single die for the injury roll, as each mortal wound is its own instance of 1 damage. When you make the injury roll, you look at the highest result of all the dice you rolled. If it is a 4 or higher, the defending model is taken out of action and removed from the board. Otherwise, the defending model receives a flesh wound.
For every flesh wound a model has, you may add 1 to the injury roll result. The more damage a model has suffered, the easier it is to take out. If a model is obscured, which is covered later in our Shooting 101 video, you can sometimes have a -1 modifier to the injury roll, as your model is ducking behind obstacles and getting some protection.
And that's it! Every time models interact in a deadly manner, you go through the same sequence: hit roll, wound roll, saving throw, injury roll. With some experience, you'll be able to rattle it off without any effort.
If you need any clarification or have a question about a rule or interaction related to what we discussed in this video, drop a comment below and we'll help you get it sorted.
Our next video will focus on the third phase of the battle round, the psychic phase. See you then!